What is true, what is certain, what is immediately striking is that W today is a land where sport is king, a nation of athletes where sport and life unite in a single magnificent effort. The proud motto, FORTIUS ALTIUS CITIUS, emblazoned on the monumental arches at the gates of each village, the splendid stadiums with their meticulously maintained cinder tracks, the gigantic wall sheets which publicize the results of sporting contests hour by hour, the celebrations held daily for the winners, the men's dress, gray tracksuits with an outside W emblazoned on the back. Such are the sights which greet the newly arrived visitor. From them he will grasp with wonderment and enthusiasm that life here is lived for the greater glory of the body.
Holy-o, ho, holy-o, ho, holy-o, ho, ho.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we have read Georges Perec's W, or The Memory of Childhood.
So interesting.
I hope you found it interesting. I hope you enjoyed it. It is one of my favorite books by one of my favorite authors. And although I haven't read it in a long time, I was excited to finally come back to it. I think I've been meaning to reread this book for about 10 years now.
Well, it was so weird, right? Like, at first I found it kind of bewildering, but then I got more and more absorbed into it, first into the autobiographical parts, like the explicitly autobiographical parts, but then more and more into the ways in which it functions as a kind of a puzzle. And I found that more and more absorbing as I kept reading.
There's something about the book that I quite like, and I guess we'll talk about it soon, but how the fictional elements of it, because it's a mix of autobiography and fiction, how the fictional elements of it are, especially in the second half, are all world building. And we've talked about how we kind of both enjoy some of the world building that has gone on in other books, like Kaya bin Yaktan, where we've enjoyed seeing the world unfolding through this. And there's quite a lot of that through here. But one of the things I love about this book is how this world unfolding is also this horror story, this creeping realization that not everything is quite as simple as it seems at the outset. And just it gets worse and worse and worse as it goes along. It's the most gripping exercise in pure world building that I've ever encountered.
Yeah, I kind of carefully didn't read any synopses of the book or anything like that ahead of time. And as a result, and we're going to have to give a spoiler alert, right? As a result, the account of W, the place, I only gradually realized how terrible it was.
Exactly. So yes, there are spoilers. Ahoy. Spoilers aplenty for this one, even though there is no plot per se. It's an autobiography and a description of a place. But yet, there's a lot that can be spoiled, and it is a short book and one that I think y'all should read. So otherwise we wouldn't be doing it, I suppose. But definitely consider reading it before going on, although I don't think it will be ruined if you know where it's going.
No, but it does hit you hard if you don't know ahead of time what kind of place you're dealing with.
Yeah.
So you said that you'd read this book a long time ago. When did you first read it?
Yeah, I read it sometime in my early 20s, I think. So that was a pretty long time ago now. I first discovered Perec when his book Avoid, in the French La Disparition, was translated into English. That's the novel he wrote without the letter E in it, and it made a lot of press. That's a pretty good gimmick.
I had heard of it.
Yeah.
I hadn't read any of his work, but I had heard of that like a million years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So I read that, and I got really interested in the author even more than that novel. The novel is interesting and good and all, but I like a lot of his other work better. Let me go over some of the biographical details real quick, and then I can start to explain what I found appealing about him. He was born in Paris in 1936. His parents were taken away from him when he was quite young. His father died for France as a soldier in the opening years of World War II when he was about 4. His mother was taken away when he was about 5 or 6, probably ended up in Auschwitz, but certainly died in that kind of scenario. He was raised by his aunt and uncle, and it was about 9 when World War II ended. But the loss that he experienced from World War II and the dislocations and disruptions in his life really haunt a lot of his writing, including this book, which is kind of curious because most of his writing is also especially marked by its playfulness. He was a member of the Oulipo, which was a group of French writers and mathematicians that gathered together. Oulipo basically stands for something that translates to the Workshop of Potential Literature, and they were interested in using mathematical ideas to develop new forms and new strictures that could compel new writing. So La Disparition doesn't have the letter E in it. He wrote a book called Life, a User's Manual, a massive book that's often considered his greatest work, which is based on knight's moves on a 10 by 10 chessboard. It's incredibly formally complicated. And he had a particular interest in writing in a bunch of different styles. So he wrote crossword puzzles, I mean, surprise, surprise, and poems and movies and essays and even made photo essays. And he loved wordplay. He loved lists. He loved trying new things. So that's also very compelling to me because I like all of those things. I've had a million different careers as well. But it's also deeply filled with this kind of sadness. Even a book like La Disparition, which you think, oh, it's a book without the letter E. What a silly gimmick. But no, it's a book in which the letter E and words with the letter E are unexpectedly missing from the world. And as soon as a character finds out and tries to articulate what's going on to someone else, they disappear as well. It becomes this haunting metaphor for the loss of his mother, the loss of his parents, the Holocaust in many ways. Without dealing with it so explicitly, there's this sense of unease that comes from a world in which people go missing like that.
He dedicates this book to E also.
Exactly, which, there's a lot to say about that. But it partially does seem like it's an echo to La Disparition. And E also, of course, is the initial of his aunt that raised him. And it also in French sounds like it's pour eux, for them. Because the letter E sounds a bit like the word for them. Ignore my terrible French, I apologize. But yeah, so there's this really thick sense of wordplay and multiple meanings happening even just in that brief dedication. And that goes throughout the novel. He died quite young in 1982 at the age of 45 from lung cancer. He was a very heavy smoker all his life, which is unfortunate.
It's a really interesting figure. I had never read any of his work before now, but I had heard of him when I was a little kid because I was obsessively devoted to the Guinness Book of World Records. And somewhere in the section on weird language things, it mentioned this book, La Disparition, a novel with no E in it. And I think it mentioned him first in connection with having composed the longest palindrome ever.
Yes.
If that's possible. And I remember thinking, that's super weird. So I kind of knew who he was all along. For years, I thought, oh, this whole Oulipo thing was just, bizarre. But now looking at it with hindsight, it's this really neat kind of counterpart to poetic form. We're very accustomed to thinking about poetic form as being something that would have all kinds of strictures and rules and tricks, rhyme and meter and the shape of stanzas and all that kind of stuff. But we don't expect that of prose generally. But what would happen if you did that with prose, right?
Yeah, it opens up all sorts of new possibilities. This book is not an Oulipian novel. It shows a clear interest in form and in play, but it's not, strictly speaking, Oulipian the way that Life a User's Manual is. There's no central mathematical conceit behind it. But nevertheless, it's definitely, coming from a congenial spirit to that. I should also add that Perec's palindrome, which was something like 1,300 words long, there has since been a longer one, and it's written in English. So I'll put the link in the show notes if you want to read that.
So before we get into it, should I say a little bit about the book?
Yeah, so this is a weird book to describe, and I'd love to hear how you're going to describe it.
Yeah, because as you said, a little bit earlier, it doesn't have a plot as such, but it has, how can I put it? There's a very rich sense of time in it and process and sequence. And in the very opening of the book, Perec sort of sets out the stakes of what he's doing for us in this really interesting way. He says this. He says, the book has two texts which simply alternate. You might almost believe they had nothing in common, but they are in fact inextricably bound up with each other, as though neither could exist on its own, as though it was only their coming together, the distant light they cast on each other, that could make apparent what is never quite said in one, never quite said in the other. And that's the end of the quote. And, you were saying before, this is not an Oulipoian book, right? But it is, how can I put it, formally incredibly creative. This idea that neither one of these two texts, which are kind of juxtaposed over and over and over again, chapter by chapter throughout the book, neither one of them totally stands on its own. I don't want to say the truth, but what he's getting at is somewhere between the two of them. And that's super neat. So There are these two stories. One of them is a story about a land of sport called W, which is based on a story that the narrator says he wrote when he was a boy. So there's this pre-existing story, and he's going to retell it here. The other story is an autobiographical account of the author's own earliest memories. And at different points in the narrative, you can see possible points of overlap, or maybe you might say intersection between these two stories. But they're fundamentally compartmentalized. One chapter about one story, one chapter about this other story. And you only see them come together, not fully come together, but touch in the very last pages of the book. But the book is also in two parts in another way. It's divided into part 1, which is chapters 1 through 11, and part 2, which is chapters 12 through 37. And the autobiographical chapters in part 1 are even numbered, and in part 2, the autobiographical chapters are odd numbered. And I noticed this because I could see that Perec was really interested in form and thinking about how that might play out. The non-autobiographical chapters in part 2 are about the sport island of W, and we're going to talk a lot more about how sport is described, what sport is for, and how it changes over the course of part 2. But the non-autobiographical chapters in part 1 are a little bit different. They kind of set the stage for the even-numbered chapters about W in part 2. So it is a little complicated, but there's all these symmetries that order the shape of the whole book. And I was deeply absorbed by that. Like, I don't know if everybody's attracted to that, but I love that kind of formal shit. Right. The narrator of the chapters opens the book by saying this. He says, "For years I put off telling the tale of my voyage to W." And this narrator, the one who's doing the W chapters, he goes by the name Gaspard Winkler. And he goes on to explain how he's been searching for the traces of his history, he says. He's trying to figure out who he really is, where he's been, what his story is. And he receives a mysterious letter and meets the man who sent the letter, called Otto Apfelstahl. Otto Apfelstahl tells him a strange story about a boy whose identity he, the narrator, has assumed, the real Gaspard Winkler. The boy is missing at sea, somewhere among the islands of Tierra del Fuego at the very tip of South America, and he's believed to be dead. But, Otto Apfelstahl reveals, this may not be true. So the narrator takes up the challenge that's been presented to him to seek out the truth by trying to find the island where the boy was last seen, this island W. So, like I said, the book has got this kind of symmetry in all different kinds of ways. And we can unpack each one of these aspects, the autobiographical aspect, the nature of W in its own terms, and then see how they come together maybe.
The W sections in the second half of the book, in part 2, don't feature any of the characters that we encountered in the first half. There's no Gaspard Winkler, there's no Otto Apfelstahl. It's just a description of the island and unfolding what goes on and how the society operates and how it's structured, with more and more detail about how sport informs life there, coming out as it goes along.
And it's so like kind of abstract and almost a little dry,
Yes.
all the W chapters in part 2. So I found myself like not tuning out exactly, but like I read the autobiographical chapters like, oh, I really know I'm oriented here. And then I read these weird W anatomies. And then as it goes on, you start to think about, well, what is in between these? What is the common ground here? And that's really creepy.
Before we get into talking about sports, I want to talk a little bit about the alphabet, because who doesn't love the alphabet?
Not me.
But also, this is a book with a very odd title. W, or The Memory of Childhood. W, the name of the island, named after, well, it's not quite sure. A number of different theories are given in the book as to where it gets its W name. But we do get in this translation by David Bellos, we get a sort of little translator's note at the very beginning that explains that to really think about this, we have to think about this in French, where it's not W, it's W. In other words, double V. But that also sounds a bit like some other things. So W could also be W, a double life. Or it could be W, as in oive, from Perec's Jewish/Yiddish heritage. Woe, a double woe in some ways. This idea of the V's and a doubled V takes on even more meanings further on. There's a passage where he basically describes how an X is just a V on top of another V turned upside down, right? You can picture that, I hope. And the X takes on a number of different meanings, moving from St. Andrew's cross to a swastika to the Star of David, which you can make using a lot of V's put together, to Charlie Chaplin's parody of the swastika in The Great Dictator, which is a sort of double X slightly offset from each other. And he's able to pull out all sorts of things just from these letters. And actually, letters play up differently throughout the entire book. There's all sorts of things that look like letters or are called by letters. I didn't keep track of them to see if every letter appears at some point in the book, but quite a lot of them make an appearance on their own.
Yeah, I love that passage you were alluding to. I thought it was so fascinating. Like you were saying, like the title gives us that sort of the double V, which could also be double V, or also ve, which mean whoa, right? So all those things are really cool. But that passage, I want to read a little bit of it, the one that you were just describing, because I think it's so incredibly cool. When he talks about his geometrical fantasy, he says, it's a geometrical fantasy whose basic figure is the double V and whose complex convolutions trace out the major symbols of the story of my childhood. Two V's joined tip to tip make the shape of an X, right? You can imagine it, right? By extending the branches of the X by perpendicular segments of equal length, you obtain a swastika, which itself can be easily decomposed by a rotation of 90 degrees of one of its sort of S-shaped segments on its lower arm till you get the sign SS. Placing two pairs of V's head to tail produces a figure, XX, whose branches only need to be joined horizontally, like you can imagine that second X moving, right, to take the shape, to make a Star of David. In the same line of thinking, I remember being struck by the fact that Charlie Chaplin in The Great Dictator replaced the swastika with a figure that was identical in terms of its segments, having the shape of a pair of overlapping X's. And it's like, I think you've said you're not a visualizer. Like when you read, you don't visualize, right?
No, I don't have pictures formed in my brain.
Okay, so I'm exactly the opposite, right? So when I read that passage, I see those moving, as it were. It's like it's like so trippy, that passage.
I mean, I do a lot of graphic design, so I have that other sense. However, my brain works, it isn't through anything like an actual picture. Like these manipulations totally make sense and are very sensual without actually being visualized, if that makes any sense. But yeah, that's a fantastic passage of the slippage between one meaning to another.
It's like they move from one to the next to the next. Since you get the sense of language is like this supple kind of, I want to say symbolic system, but that's not what he's talking about at all. He's talking about, I don't know what, like something, the visuality, I guess, of language.
And that is also the way that memory works, right? It's moving these ideas, these memories that you have. Upon finding out more information, they move and change. But there are several sections, including a very notable chapter early on, where he reproduces a write-up he made of what are his parents like, and annotates it, footnotes it, and corrects himself in the past quite aggressively, but showing that a lot of both his memories and his interpretations changed over time, that they get pushed around this way and that way. Quite a lot of the book is about how he cannot trust his own memory and an investigation of that. And it's because of this supple changing and interplay of interpretations, meanings, and ideas.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. I think that lines up the ways in which he talks about memory really well. Because the treatment of memory here is absolutely fascinating. Like in some ways, it's kind of straightforward. We can understand that there's missing pieces. He's trying to figure out what happened in his early childhood. He's trying to make a story for himself, right? But it's not just that he has limited knowledge and then he adds it in and then he gets more knowledge.
Quite the opposite. There's that scene where he is revisiting a place where he lived for a while when he was growing up. And he's looking at the house and
it turns out that the house he thinks it was, actually it was this totally other house. And he's just full of uncertainty. He's like, I think David, Rose, Izzy, Cecile and I lived together, but like he's really not sure who was there. Then a little later he talks about like his first memories, firm memories were of school. So there's all this uncertainty, and he describes pictures or photographs in incredible detail. And again, it's not like he's just adding pieces to an existing puzzle. It's like a photograph turns up and then it turns out that it's totally at odds with the other things he thought he knew. It's so weird.
Yeah, some things get resolved or clarified, but other things don't, or even when they get resolved, it sometimes leads to more questions, like the story of his memory of his broken scapula. He imagines a time when he falls dramatically, breaks his scapula in such a way that you can't just put a cast on it really easily, so it becomes very elaborate, and he wins a lot of sympathy from friends and family and so forth, and this is his whole thing that he remembers quite clearly, that no one else in his family remembers at all. And then he meets up with like a childhood friend, and they're like, no, I don't remember that happening to you, but I do remember that happening to another kid. And it seems like that's what happened. Like that seems like it clarifies what's going on, that some other kid had this accident and he transferred that story onto himself the way that kids might, sure. But even though that solves the sort of question as to like, what happened? What is the truth? There's still this bigger question of like, well, why did that happen? Why did he think that? What's going on? Why didn't he recognize it until somebody else pointed it out to him? And that can't be easily answered.
Yeah, like the whole question of where did these false memories come from, right? And this is something that he has to wrestle with over and over again. And there's this theme of suspension that keeps coming up over and over again. And I was really curious about what you made of that. Like it turns up with regard to the sling, that supports the arm, but also like all other kinds of places, allusions to parachutists and so on. This idea of hanging from straps. It comes up over and over and over again. I find that super weird and super puzzling. And he draws attention to it himself. He'll say at one point, a triple theme runs through this memory: parachute, sling, truss. It suggests suspension, support, almost artificial limbs. To be, I need a prop. But that doesn't fully explain it. It just keeps coming back as a kind of a remainder or a residue or something. Did you make sense of that?
I didn't, but there's so much I didn't make sense of, in the sense of I couldn't organize everything into a coherent set of truths. It's incredibly amorphous. It's incredibly not quite there, which he talks about how he doesn't have many early memories of childhood. And he's reconstructing a lot of these from interviewing people, interviewing family members, looking at photographs, finding documents, finding scraps of paper that he'd written parts of the W story on and so forth. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. I don't have a lot of memories from childhood either. I didn't have anything nearly as traumatic happen to me as what happened to George Perec. But nevertheless, just for whatever reason, I don't remember in great detail much of what happened before puberty, let's say, except for similar kinds of things that might hook me, that might keep me hanging, photographs and family tales and things like that.
It's interesting you say that. I'm so sympathetic to the moments when Perec is describing looking at these photographs and trying to make sense of them and trying to understand what was going on at the time. And he also alludes to talking to family members to try to get some kind of understanding of who was there and where it was and what was going on. Because I do have a lot of memories of early childhood. And so I'm absolutely fascinated whenever I run across a snapshot of houses that I knew or houses that I lived in or visited and so on, because they provide this kind of, I don't know what to call it, external verification or additional information about a place that I know, but my memories are often very much at odds with this documentary evidence, right? So when he describes those moments, I was like, they're so resonant for me. I had this really trippy experience once a few years ago when I reconnected with a cousin I hadn't talked to since we were both children. And it was really great to be in contact again after so many years. But we were talking about places we had been, his house, my house, the speakers that my dad had or the couch that was in his living room, and finding pictures and sharing them with one another. So this whole idea of like, how do we get access to our past and what kind of story do we tell about it? And to what extent are we talking about truth and to what extent are we talking about a story that we need, that we want? That gets unpacked here in a really rich way. And we haven't even started talking about sports.
Well, I think it might make an interesting moment to turn to that because, of course, one of the interesting things about the W section, the sports island section, based on a story he wrote when he was roughly hitting puberty, is that it is very specific. It's very detailed. There are definitely aspects of the story, especially in the first half with the missing child and the doubled names and so forth, that are very vague. But when we get to describing the island, it is all very matter of fact and laid out. And the island works in this very mathematical way.
Yeah, it's very orderly. We get almost that kind of a map, like not an actual physical drawn map, but like a sense of the topography of the place, the rivers, the shape of the land, the configuration of towns. And then we start hearing about the teams and the way in which they interact. That geometrical sense just really comes to the fore. I found that like both fascinating and bewildering.
Did you find it meshed well with the idea of an island that is overly devoted to sports, that it would be structured around such mathematical order?
Well, yes, sort of. I mean, in the sense that, I know I've talked about this before. I mean, I liked watching some sports growing up. Like, I used to watch a lot of car racing with my dad, and then also boxing because he loved boxing. But I didn't watch a whole lot of like team-based sports where you have like those very intricate playoff structures. But in recent years, I've been watching a lot of sports with my son, and he's very into that whole, not just, following particular teams, but really understanding how they all interact in this kind of like complex numerical ecosystem, especially when you get to playoffs. So like he's really into soccer and the Premier League and stuff like that. And like there's points and teams move up into the first league or down into the second league. And, the matches it's like a dance or something like that these teams carry out, right? And you could say the same thing about hockey or baseball or any of these things, right? So he follows all that. So I don't understand it in terms of being someone who can do those calculations. But I've seen people talk about that dance of teams. And that seems to be what's going on here, that kind of intricate, performative machine almost that brings all the teams together in contact at the appropriate moment. But there's not joyfulness here, or how can I put it? It turns out to be a very different kind of sports environment.
Yeah. Yeah, it starts off very innocuous. You've got these 4 villages, these 4 sort of Olympic village style villages with the athletes in them, the young men, and they meet up and compete. They compete with their neighbors on a fairly regular basis, and then they meet up for various larger scale competitions throughout the 4 villages. There's one that happens every year. There's one that happens 4 times a year. There's one that happens however many times a year. Like, this all seems normal and regimented, and it seems like it could potentially be a nice time.
Yeah, it looks pretty fine at the outset,
Yeah,
right?
it definitely.
It's a regular schedule, but then for me, the tipping point comes when he starts talking about food and when they eat and when they don't eat.
Ah, yes, the food thing. I thought about that as I was getting to that point, that this would have been an interesting book to have done under the food category. But yeah, tell us about the food.
Well, but that's what I meant by like a tipping point. When I kind of like, at first it looks like, oh, Sports Island, they're doing sports. That's great. That's nice. It's a little dry, but like, fine. This is kind of interesting. And then you get to the point where the athlete's diet is being described. And there's this really odd little passage. It says this: only 264 athletes out of a total of 1,320 have a chance of eating dinner. After local championships or selection trials, the number falls to 132. These meals are carefully designed to fulfill the athlete's dietary and caloric needs only in part. Athletes are thus subjected to a consistently deficient intake, which in the long run seriously undermines their resistance to muscle fatigue. Right? So you're like, that's just weird. Like, you're like, how does that work, right? And then it says this: from this point of view, victors' banquets with their fresh fruit, sweet wines, dried bananas, dates, strawberry preserves, compotes, and chocolate tablets therefore constitute a veritable carbohydrate compensation indispensable for the athlete's physical health. That's a super weird passage, right? Because he's telling you, first of all, that their eating is limited. It fulfills their caloric needs, but it fulfills them only in part. There's intake, but it's consistently deficient, right? And so you're like, okay, that's weird. So they're kind of always hungry or always not quite fed enough. But then you get this luscious sentence: fresh fruit, sweet wines, dried bananas, dates, strawberry preserves, compote, and chocolate. And so the desire for food, right? Delicious food, sweet food, calorie-full food is there. And so you get this sense of hunger. I don't know, I found that really poignant. That was when I was like, whoa, what's going on here?
Yeah, because only the winner gets to be fed.
Yeah.
And this is all very intentional on behalf of the people organizing the sports, because
that suffering is built into the system.
Yes, because you have this idea that you won't do your best unless there's stakes, unless it means something to you. And so therefore they have to use that food to keep people engaged in the process. They use a lot of other methods, we'll find out. But yes, and because it would be boring if the same people won, they got well fed, and therefore they're going to do better the next day when the next competition happens. It's important to feed them and encourage them to overeat, to overdo it. So they're just wrecked the next day. So they have hangover and they've had way too much sugar and they're bloated and they will fail the next day. And that way, it seems at first, more people will get a reasonable dietary intake, caloric intake, but it's actually more devious and complicated than that.
Yeah, and then we learn as time goes by that the judges are also incredibly capricious. The rules are applied in a selective way. I mean, this is increasingly dystopic, right?
Yeah. Again, this connection with sport and these judges that decide that, well, at first it's like luck is important. If you stumble, if something happens, that's just part of it. We saw a bit of that in the Aeneid, right?
Yeah.
Things happen and the judges say, well, luck is part of this and we're going to treat that as part of sport.
Yeah, with Nisus and Euryalus, right, where there's the accident, right, and then that requires creative administration of prizes on the part of Aeneas, right? Or even in Beyond a Boundary, when we're talking about C.L.R. James and this idea of, what's cricket and what's not cricket, like what the rules are, who is bound by the rules, and what to do if the rules seem to be improperly observed. Like there's a whole code of conduct. But here, it looks like there is some sort of sense of order and sense of, fair play and competition. But as the pages go by, the rug is kind of pulled out from under you, and you find out the system is, I want to say the system is corrupt, but I don't even know if that's right. The system is
capricious.
Yeah, it destroys the people inside it.
Yeah, it's completely arbitrary and capricious, and it's just like, well, we've decided that you won because
we did.
Because the number on your tracksuit is the same as the time of the winner, and therefore you're the real winner. And it's like, okay, that can happen. Anything can happen. It's not a meritocracy, right? It's not meant to be. Sport is the thing that allows the best players to come through. It's this idea of sport as something that allows something to happen, and that you shouldn't get too confident in your position, even if you are the winner, even if you were the cream of the crop. That might be true today, but tomorrow that could all be taken away from you.
And the individual athletes, start to appear more and more almost like cogs in a machine. Like, so novices, so those are people who have just entered into the athlete world, have no names, right? They're just called novice, and they have just an emblem sewn onto the back of their tracksuits, a large triangle of white material, the apex pointing down. Practicing athletes don't have names, but they have nicknames. And then athletes are officially designated not by a name, but only by the initial letter of their village, followed by a serial number. So there's this, that's also super creepy, right? Like they're numbers in a system, right? They're not human beings.
Exactly. And then when they win competitions, they take on the name of whoever was the first person to win or get second place or whatever in that competition. So that becomes their name. They can collect a few different names this way.
Yeah. Westerman, Pfister, Cummings.
But it's just your position. It's just whatever you most recently won. Same thing with the nicknames, which originally started out as, okay, we got a tall, skinny guy. Let's call him Weed. But then when Weed gets his own real name or another new kid comes in, we're just going to pass Weed down to him. So it becomes an entirely arbitrary signifier.
Well, they become like labels or something instead of names, right?
Yeah, it's meant to show that you don't have any name, which is an interesting thing for Perec, who had a weird relationship with his name. He talks about it a bit here, but his name was originally Perec, the C pronounced in the Polish way. He was the only person who had it spelled that way. All the rest of his living family, his aunt and uncle, for example, spelled it P-E-R-E-T-Z. He kept the C. His parents kept the C, but they died. So he was the only Perec.
Well, also, it was a thing that saved him, right? Because he had a baptismal certificate that had the last name Perec, and he had a sort of, Christian reading first name. And so his identity did not cause him to meet the same fate that his mother met. Because the Perec can look like a Breton name.
Right. But it's also not his name.
No, but it's the thing that saves him. That's the weird thing, right?
So this is one example of the weird ways in which these two stories echo each other. This sense of the double life, the double name, the slippage between what this means, what this nickname based on a physical attribute means, and then what it doesn't mean when it gets put onto another person.
Yeah. And so the nature of this environment, like I said, it's looking increasingly dystopic, and the anonymization and the way that numbering is working, and also these emblems that they're wearing, described at one point with regard to one group of the athletes as a large triangle with that apex pointing down. And then elsewhere, they've got a large triangle of white material, the apex pointing up, right? And so if we think about the way in which letters have been functioning in that passage that we discussed earlier with the W and then the X and so on, right? Together they make a Star of David, right?
Exactly.
Should we say a little bit about the Olympics? We talked about this as being a kind of an island that's preoccupied with sport, but it's specifically understood as being connected to the Olympics, we hear that their motto is FORTIUS ALTIUS CITIUS on this island. And that's an inversion. It's a backward version of the Olympic motto, Citius Altius Fortius, which is Latin for faster, higher, stronger. And I thought that was a really interesting move, like in two ways. One is he's giving us this Olympic frame of reference, that this is sort of like an Olympic environment. We might think about what that's about. But also it's backwards. And so, like, on the one hand, that's part of that whole play at the level of language that we've already seen Perec engaging in. But it's also like, is this a kind of an anti-Olympics or an inversion in some kind of way?
Well, it certainly seems to miss the point of the Olympics, or at least what the Olympics is claiming to be, by making this sport not at all about what is the best of human achievement, but just about this kind of gruesome entertainment, this reification of the arbitrariness of life.
Yeah. But I wondered if it was personal, too, in a way as well. Like, if you think about the Olympics, what's the Olympics that would be proximate to that period of time that Perec is trying to revive? There is no 1940 Olympics. There is no 1944 Olympics. There's a 1936 Olympics, which is also the year that he's born, and it's in Berlin.
Right.
Right? So it's like autobiographical in a very weird, mediated kind of way to think about the Olympics for Perec.
Yeah.
Right? Isn't that freaky? We were talking earlier about the nature of W and like discovering how dystopic it was. When you read this book the first time, like, do you still remember the feeling of surprise? Do you still remember that little sense of like, oh my God, this is a horrible place?
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember what that was like? Because for me, it's very fresh, right? Because I just read this book.
Are you asking if I remember the turning point for it when I suddenly realized it was a horror bit?
Yeah.
I don't know if I remembered that. Certainly, I mean, I'm not a sporty person. I don't like physical activity. And this idea of an island where all the young boys are forced into sporting life never sounded like appealing to me.
That's bad enough already.
But I think you mentioned early on the description of the novices, the young boys who are first brought to the villages and who are not yet competitors, but have to spend a few months in preparation for this. So there's a description of the childhood time before that, where kids are just kept in a big warehouse, it seems, not necessarily in a cold and heartless way, but just in the sense where they're just left lightly attended.
Yeah, the older kids take care of the younger kids. That's it.
Yeah, there's no real pedagogy. There's a bit of adult supervision for some basic stuff and maybe medical care or something. But you've got a few 2,000 kids, I think it was described as, somewhere around there, just sort of living there, doing whatever they want all day. And it seems potentially idyllic, especially if you are a kid who likes to do what they're going to do and maybe always dreamed of not having the parental support system and so forth. You wanted that kind of independence. If Lord of the Flies seemed like a nice fantasy to you, then yes. Yeah. Then at the very end of that section, of course, it's revealed that they're in this building that's surrounded by a moat and a fence, and that they have no sense of what the world outside of it is like. They have no contact with the rest of the world until they're taken off to the villages, until the boys are taken off to the villages. And they spend a long time before they become novices of it, I believe, but they spend several months basically chained to the bed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first 6 months.
Yeah.
I know.
It's like really blatantly awful.
Yeah. And that same chapter, like, you're right, there's this weird sense that it's a little bit idyllic in some ways, but there are also these signs already that this is going to end really badly. So first of all, like, you have boys and girls together living the same life in youth homes until they're 13 or 14. But there's never as many girls as boys, right? Because it says the number of women is quite restricted. It rarely goes beyond 500. It is the custom, in fact, to allow all male children to survive unless they have some sort of defect, but only one girl child out of every 5 is kept.
Yes.
Whoa.
Yep.
Almost missed that, right? It's like, that's not good. And then they stay together until they're 13 or 14. And then in that 15th year, the boys are sent off to become novices and then athletes. The girls are sent off to the women's quarters.
Yes.
And like, they just do housekeeping stuff, right?
Well.
And you're like, oh, okay. But then it doesn't look so good when we hear about how the women never leave their quarters except for the Atlantiads, which is one particular competition.
Yes. And if you haven't figured out that this is a terrible system by now, this competition will really drive it home.
Yeah. And also, fair warning, this is a really bad passage.
Yes.
But I think it's an important one, I think. So I think it's worth looking at. Atlantiads are held about once a month. The women thought to be fertile are taken to the central stadium. Their clothing is removed and they are released onto the track where they start to run as fast as they can. They are allowed a head start of half a lap before the best W athletes, that is to say the best 2 in each event, making in all, as there are 22 events in 4 villages, 176 men, are sent off in pursuit. 1 lap is usually all that the runners need to catch up with the women, and as a rule it is right in front of the podium, either on the cinder track or on the grass, that they get raped.
Yep.
And again, this is like such a paragraph. So right at the beginning, we know in a way how this is going to end. The women thought to be fertile are taken to the stadium. Like, you immediately know where this is going to end up. And then it's seemingly like a competition, right? It's seeming like a sports event. They're put on the track, they run, they get a head start. And there's this mathematical precision about how many athletes there are, how many men exactly, how long it takes for the runners to catch up with the women and where it happens, right? So there's this strange combination of precision and almost this mathematical kind of quality, and then the horror of what's happening. I've never seen anything quite like that anywhere else.
Yeah.
I guess one of the reasons that this passage strikes me so much is, first, it's horrible. It's part of the dystopia of W, but also it's an opportunity to think about the missing in between, like the thing that Perec is trying to get at. He's talking about the loss of his own childhood, and he's talking about the loss of his parents. But in particular, I think he's talking about the loss of his mother, because that's the point he keeps sort of coming back to in the autobiographical passages. And so this description of what happens to the women of W isn't quite the same story, but there's a sense that it's like, I don't know, the shadow of the other story. Like, in other words, the women of W have something to do with the loss that's being chronicled in the autobiographical sections, I think.
It's not quite him trying to fill in the blanks as to what happened to his mother after she was disappeared.
No.
But it's that kind of energy being put into a new shape, perhaps when he was, 12 or 13. The weird sexual thoughts certainly can emerge, or sexualized thoughts can certainly emerge, but
these are the kinds of things that happen in a place like W.
Exactly.
Right. And so the convergence of these two storylines begins to come out as we recognize the horror that lies in W, and we realize that there is an unnamed loss or horror in the autobiographical sections as well. So what was your sense of how these come together? Like, I have a sense of how these came together for me and how I kind of saw, it's almost like, when you look at a stereoscope, you've got these two images and you sort of look at them in the right way through a viewer and they make one image. I felt like the two storylines were kind of doing that toward the end. And I started recognizing in retrospect moments that made that possible.
Well, there's certainly little echoes throughout, little moments that bounce back and forth between the two stories. I don't know how many of those I realized on my first read through, but I certainly saw several of them this time. But by the very end of it, it's become clear that W, this island that no one is quite sure where it is, that it's very hard to get to, it's got very sheer cliffs, and is for the most part uninhabitable, but there's this little area in the middle that could be lived in, that this isolated place that doesn't like to draw attention to itself where this sort of thing goes on is obviously a concentration camp, or is deeply comparable to one, let's say. And he makes that explicit in the final chapters. Yeah.
And it gets completely explicit in the very last chapter, which interestingly is a quotation from another work, David Rousset's Univers concentrationnaire, where it's describing what happens in concentration camps, beatings, and enforced sport, I guess, right? One of the games consists of making the prisoners dress and undress several times a day, very fast, or again, making them run in and out of the block while two SS stand at the door and hit them, making men turn around very fast under the whip for hours on end, and so on and so on. So that's when it becomes totally explicit. Like, if you missed what was going on here, you can't miss it anymore here. But even before that, there are these weird little kinds of, like you said, crossing points or hints that something is bouncing back and forth between. One of them is very much near the end when he describes how in the end of the autobiographical section, he talks about his aunt taking him to see an exhibition. He said, "My aunt took me to see an exhibition about concentration camps. I remember the photographs of the walls of the gas chambers showing scratch marks made by the victim's fingernails and a set of chessmen made from bits of bread." And then in the next chapter, which is where we're in the realm of W, he says how with bits of bread laboriously rolled between the fingers, sportsmen make themselves little dice. Right? So the chessmen and the little dice are not the same, but in both cases you have this idea of little playing pieces made out of bread. So it's not the same world, right? But there's like, I don't know what to call it, like an echo or a harmony or something that links these two narratives and these two worlds. And then there's another one too that I noticed when I was rereading right before we sat down to do this, where it's the same passage near the end about the walls of the gas chamber showing scratch marks, but the connection is not to playing pieces, but to a passage very early on in the book when we're getting set up for the W narrative, and there's a description of the mother of that child who gave the narrator his name, right? And it says this of the mother, Cecilia Winkler. It says, when the Chilean rescue team found her in the boat that had been lost, her heart had only just stopped beating, and her bleeding fingernails had made deep scratches in the oak door.
Oh, right.
So again, it's not the same thing, right? Like it's the boat and the cabin and the oak door. And on the other hand, it's the walls of the gas chambers. But in both cases, you have scratches and bleeding fingernails, right? I mean, he's looking for his mother, right?
Yeah. The other passage right before the end, in the last section about W itself, describes the athletes. And it's as if the curtain is finally pulled back, or the sort of the punchline is revealed. If you just look and see these athletes of skin and bone, ashen-faced, their backs permanently bent, their skulls bald and shiny, their eyes full of panic, and their sores suppurating, if you see all these indelible marks of humiliation without end, of boundless terror, all of it evidence administered every hour, every day, every instant, of conscious, organized, structured oppression, if you just look and see the workings of this huge machine, each cog of which contributes with implacable efficiency to the systematic annihilation of men, then it should come as no great surprise that the performances put up are utterly mediocre. The 100 meters is run in 23.4 seconds, the 200 meters in 51 seconds. The best high jumper has never exceeded 1.30 meters.
That's an awful passage.
It's just devastating. But, that description looks like photos of people in concentration camps.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it's so vivid. Yeah. This is a hard book to read, but it's very moving.
And there's a lot of delights to the book as well.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, it seems awful to say it's also a playful book, but it is. It's intricate. It's like, I don't know, like a Rubik's Cube or like a puzzle or, and it's got a beautiful set of symmetries to it and so on. And I guess this is how you make order out of chaos, right? Like how you make something out of badness, right? I'm really glad you suggested we read it. It's quite something.
Let's see. Let's talk about something a little bit lighter to end with. He talks a bit about reading and rereading in a section, which is quite remarkable and fun. And
I
feel like
that
we
passage.
should go over it. Yeah.
And I wondered if, when I read it, actually, I was like, oh, wow, this totally speaks to me. And I wondered if it speaks to you as well. Let me read a little bit of it. He's talking about rereading books. He says, they were to my mind virtually part of history, an inexhaustible fount of memory, of material for rumination, of a kind of certainty. The words were where they should be, and the books told a story you could follow. You could reread, and on rereading, re-encounter, enhanced by the certainty that you would encounter those words again, the impression you had felt the first time. This pleasure has never ceased for me. I do not read much, but I have never stopped rereading Flaubert and Jules Verne, Roussel and Kafka, Léris and Queneau. I reread the books I love, and I love the books I reread. And each time it is the same enjoyment, whether I reread 20 pages, 3 chapters, or the whole book. An enjoyment of complicity, of collusion, or, more especially, and in addition, of having it in the end, found kin again. I love that. Are you a big rereader? Because I don't reread very often, but I do it with some frequency, and it's very emotional.
I used to be a big rereader, and now I am less of a rereader, partially because there is so much to read. But certainly, I'm rereading this book, and it is very much that experience of encountering it and thinking through what I loved about this book when I first encountered it, how it's informed me in the 20-ish years since, and why I continue to love it, and what the experience of getting to spend time with Georges Perec's mind and his sense of play and his sense of sadness as well, what that means and what that is. And
Yeah.
it's a complete delight. But I did really love that description of finding the words where they should be.
Yeah, I knew you would love that, right? Because there's different kinds of rereading, right? Like there's a book you read and then you reread it at another point, and maybe you might even reread it again. But like it's like meeting the same person 3 different times over a period of years. And then there's that almost compulsive rereading of the thing you really like. And he says that neat thing, like it doesn't matter if you reread 20 pages or 3 chapters, the whole book. It doesn't matter. It's the same kind of like turn on, kind of, because it doesn't just lie in the fact that you're rereading. It lies, he says, this is so great. It lies in the fact you're going to do it again. It's the encounter is enhanced by the certainty that you would encounter those words again, the impression you had felt the first time. Like you're rereading with the knowledge that you will reread again at some point in the future. Right?
Yeah.
Which is so crazy. It's so great.
Do you ever feel that way the first time you're reading the book?
Very, very, very rarely when I'm reading a book for the first time, and if I'm really, really into it, I'll start rereading the book again immediately.
Oh, yes. I've done that on very rare occasions, at least gone back and reread the first chapter.
Yeah.
No, but I was more thinking in terms of reading the book with a certain different kind of care or attention because you know you'll read it again.
Well, it's like, I don't know how to put it into words, this sense of familiarity where I think when he says you're going to have the impression you had the first time, like the book might have changed for you, might take different things out of it, but the feeling, like the thing you're getting from it, you got it the first time, and therefore every time you read the book, you get it again. And so you are connected to the person you were when that happened for you before, right? Again, it's about this retrieval of past, like this preoccupation with memory, right? And this lost past, right? Because it takes you back to who you were, the person that you're almost estranged from, right? Because you're not that person anymore.
Yeah. No.
Right? In other words, this reading is all about you and your sense of self.
It certainly can be. I mean, whenever I've gone back to reread the books of my childhood, of my teenage years or earlier, it is very much that encountering myself.
Oh, for sure.
And it's always striking.
I can't wait until we read Harriet the Spy, because it's going to be totally like that.
That was my sense of Harriet the Spy when I came back to it and read it for the first time as an adult. It was just like, oh wow, this book. But we'll talk about that someday. But I was wondering about it in terms of reading a book and the sense of thinking that I will come back to this work, therefore I don't need to worry about this time through. Or I can save something for later. I just read through Lord of the Rings for the first time. People who've been paying a lot of attention might know that this was going to happen. And it was great. We'll talk about it more if we ever get around to doing an episode on it. But there were all sorts of moments where I was both aware of reading it for the first time as a book that I might well come back to, especially if we do an episode on it someday. And so wanting to make sure that I had a good foundation so that if we do go back to it, I don't have to spend a month reading it. And also the sense of like, well, there will be bits that I'm not going to pay attention to now. The poems, for example, it's fine. I'm going to let those go. Maybe someday I will come back to them and really be able to appreciate what they're doing in this text. But right now, right now it's not happening. So I'm not going to worry about that.
I think that's wonderful. I think that's a mature kind of reading. Like it's a kind of reading I only came to like later life adulthood. Because for a long time I was like, I must squeeze all the juice from this orange. You know, I'm reading this book. I must get all the things. And I don't feel like that anymore. I feel like what you were just describing, that I'll read it and I'm like, oh, I got all these things and there's more things. Wow, I can come back to that. That container is still halfway full or whatever, or a third full or whatever, you know. And that's wonderful. That's such a pleasurable thing. In a way that I don't think I could have appreciated before.
So that ends our look at sports. It feels like we've seen a lot of interesting aspects of sports or ways to think about sports, and yet it also seems like we've barely scratched the surface of what could be said and what has been said.
You know, one of the things we've said in the past is that we often have a theme that draws together a cluster of 3 works, but then we often discover a kind of an unexpected theme, like an underneath theme or a counterpart kind of theme.
Sure.
And I'm wondering what that is here. I mean, it's not violence, it's like systems or something like that.
Yeah, structural oppression.
Yeah, well, yeah. Yeah, there's something else there that unifies these works that we might want to think about more.
Our next topic, our next cluster is going to be about education as we, oh dear, think about going back to school.
Yeah.
That's really fraught.
Yeah.
That is more fraught than we thought it was going to be when we picked that topic for this.
It's timely. And we will also be talking about systems, I mean, that's inevitably going to be there as well, right?
Yeah. So our 3 books will be, we're going to start with Dante's Purgatorio.
Yay.
Got to get back to Dante, especially after we read the Aeneid, and we get to visit with Virgil and wish him adieu.
Yeah. That'll be great. And it's very systematic. I think it's going to be so interesting. I love that part.
It's my favorite part of the Commedia. I'm super looking forward to rereading it. Then we'll be looking at Eden Robinson's novel Monkey Beach,
which I have not read before. I'm looking forward to it.
I haven't either, but it comes strongly recommended. And finally, we'll be dipping back into the medieval with Petrus Alfonsi's Disciplina Clericalis.
Also called The Scholar's Guide in one of the most accessible translations.
Exactly. And this is a medieval collection of short stories?
Sort of, yeah. It's this 12th century Latin work. Not super long, but super interesting. It's in the form of a dialogue, and it's got all the little short exemplary narratives. And it's just a really great example of a kind of writing that would become influential in very unexpected ways.
Excellent. So we will have links for those in the show notes, and that'll be a fun topic.
Yeah, and something unexpected is going to come out of it as well.
So, if you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter at @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/33, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. If you haven't checked them out, go for it. There may be something else you like. But until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.